Hello and welcome to the material chapter of this essential course. So here we're going to talk about different setups and different materials that we can build in Notch. Here we will have a start point and finish point again. So I think we can just get started. So I'm pressing on the first layer, real-time material start, and I'm going to go for the node graph. And I'm going to walk you through different nodes that we have here in the scene so we're all familiar with what we have to work with. We have a camera. We're actually looking through this camera now. Here on the side, we have a little lighting system. So we have environment map piped into the skylight. The only node you are not familiar here probably is the fog scattering. So it does exactly what the name states. It just makes a little bit of fog scattering for us here in the background. We have a floor setup. So this grid right here. And then we have 6 different setups of a 3D model, primitive shape, and a naming convention, which describes exactly what we're building in this specific setup. So let's start with the first one. First one says texture maps. So just like any other 3D application, Notch supports texture maps. And as we briefly touched on in a previous chapter, we can actually add material alterations and texture maps to the actual 3D object or primitive 3D. But it's much smarter to build an external material because then you can use the very same material node and pipe it to several 3D objects. So if you need to make an alteration, you just make one change and 20 things in your scene actually changes. So with that said, I'm going to grab a material node and I'm going to connect it to the first input here, shape 3D, and the first input in the 3D object, dark gray. Okay, so both of these 3D objects are now referring to this material for the material information. So I'm just highlighting that fact with the color change. Cool. So texture maps. We have a whole drop-down here for different texture maps that we can apply. So we can choose either to access them via drop-down. So I can just go for color texture, base color. There we go. And it's applied. Or alternatively, we can choose whichever the texture we want to apply and drag it in to the node graph. It will come in as a video loader. Then we can pipe in the very same material to the very same corresponding channel via the input. So color texture, that's the first one there. There we go. So why would one choose to connect it externally? Well, connecting materials externally actually gives you more versatility. So if I wanted to recolor this, I can always grab tint and set some kind of a coloring there. All of a sudden, you can do all the post-processing for your materials, for your material textures here in the node graph. I'm going to leave it as default for now. Okay, let's come back to the material node and let's find a normal map. I'm going to apply the normal map from the drop-down in this case. As soon as I do, I see that there's some kind of a change happening to my model. All of a sudden, we have this little fake 3D embossing. That's exactly what normal map in the simplest terms does. It literally gives an impression of a 3D deformation. Good, it is working. Perfect. There is one more material map that I want to apply, that's displacement. So in this case, for displacement, I'm going to use rock-solve height. So in 3D industry, there is no agreed upon naming convention for this property. It could be called displacement, height, or bump. All of those 3 naming conventions are correct. So very likely the naming convention will correspond with the very 3D software that you use or the texture map package that you are either building or downloading from the internet. Right, so with displacement map set in, I think I can go a little bit higher here in the attributes list and work a little bit on the displacement slider. So as soon as I start to slide the displacement, I see how it affects the model. All of a sudden, we're displacing this 3D object in accordance to the texture that we've just given. So I'm going to go for the wireframes view so you can actually see how that wraps around. Small little tip here. The wrapping of a texture on a 3D model relies a lot on how many points do you actually have on that model. So for instance, if I get back now to the wireframe view and I press on this shape 3D, you will notice that the subdivisions here are quite high. So I actually increased it from the get-go. Now the default here would be 20 by 20. Now notice how rigid this looks. So if you are wrapping some 3D model in accordance to a texture, I would always bump up the subdivisions on X and Y just so it looks slicker. Now, mind you, this introduces a little bit more computation for your GPU, so be cautious with the numbers when you are adding those. And you can actually see the number of triangulations that you are introducing. So 20 by 20 is 800, 90 by 90 is all of a sudden 16,200. Right, so now we just tried out 3 different textures. So we have normal map, we have color texture, which is actually piped in externally, and we have displacement, and we have a displacement slider here. So before we move on to the next setup, which is substance materials, I'm just going to mention a couple of good places to purchase textures. One of my favorite ones is Polygon. So Polygon is a subscription-based website which allows you to download quite a few different texture maps. So anything from color to normal to displacement to you name it, they have it all. Another alternative would be Quixel. So Quixel not only sells textures, it actually sells 3D models. So there's a big team of people going around the world making photolithometry, making a lot of cool 3D objects and befitting textures to them. This is again subscription based. Do check it out. It's quite a neat service here. We will come back to the rest of the handy websites as we progress through the setups. Right, setup 2, substance material. Notch is integrated and supports substance materials. So you can either build your own or just go ahead and purchase some pre-made substance materials. Now, what makes substance materials interesting? Well, they're very versatile and they are generative. Let me showcase you exactly that. If you go to the view, bins, you will see that there's a little list of pre-made tools for you and for your reference. So in this case, we're going to go for materials. And in the materials, I see that I have a whole vast list of different materials available for me, which is already made for our use by Notch team. I think the one that I want to try out in this case, it will be metal. So I think I'm going to go for the grunge metal. As soon as I drag in bin, I see that it came in as a group. Now we spoke about groups in the UI chapter. So I'm just going to remind you that to ungroup things, you should press Ctrl-Shift-G. Now we have this material available for us to use. Now, if I click on the grunge material, on grunge metal material, you will see that the options here and the properties are a little bit different than in the regular material. It has more options. Let's plug it up to these models. Let's see how it behaves and what does it do. So 3D object and shape 3D. There we go. We can see that it's actually applied now. That's great. So the first dropdown that we have here is the actual material. If you have quite a few of them preloaded to your resources, all of them will be available for you here in this dropdown. What is following is the width and height. So all of a sudden we can dynamically upscale or downgrade the settings here. So all of a sudden this material here is 4K. I find it very handy because depending on what you're building, sometimes you want this material to be in higher quality, or if it's far away in the back, it might as well be something really, really small. Let's move on to the substance parameters. You can open all of these parameters in Substance Designer to your use in other 3D software, in this case in Notch. So should you want to be able to change the depth, the age, or the luminosity of this material, you can always make sure to open these parameters from the Substance Designer application. I'm just going to quickly come back to the list of handy websites. Substance Designer is definitely it. I'd say if there was an 8th day in a week, this would be my 8th day studying and learning Substance Designer. It is node-based, it is generative, and it is highly useful. Again, we have quite a few of them available here for us under the materials, under the bins. So view, bins. So the third setup, metallicness. We already built this together in a previous chapter, so this is more of a recap. Again, we're going to need a material node, so I'm grabbing that from the list. And I'm going to connect it to the first input of the shape 3D and the first input of the 3D object. I see that it's kicking in, it's actually working. So for the metallicness to work, there's two things needed. First, we have to make sure that we have environment map available for us, which we do. That's great. And then in the material, we have to say, hey, I want these two 3D objects that are connected with this material to regard environment map. So I'm going to tick that on. So as soon as the environment map is ticked on and the material node is connected to the 3D objects, we can see that there's some reflections happening. We can actually translate that to metallicness now. And we have a slider for that. As I probably mentioned before, metallicness should be treated as an on-off setting. You should never leave it on a half or 0.5 setting. If you are seeking something like plastic or rubber, well, for that, I would say you should use specularity, and we're going to talk about that next. But for now, metallicness is on-off, and then you definitely have a roughness setting to tweak to your liking. So I think I'm going to set it to something like, well, 0.3. Right, so specularity. Specularity setup is very, very similar to metallicness. So we do need a material node. We do have to make sure that we have environment map in the scene. And I know for a fact that we do. And now we just have to tick on environment mapping. So instead of tweaking metallicness now, we can actually tweak the specularity. And we can bump it quite high. So for instance, I can set it 2 by 2. And I can reduce the color of the setting, then it will just pop through a little bit better. There we go. Obviously, we can set the color for the actual specularity too, but I think I'm going to leave it at the default white. Great, let's move on to the fifth setup, transparency. So when I'm talking about transparency, I'm not talking about building a glass setting. If you want to build glass with refractions and all the other physical properties that glass would have, you would have to use path tracing. Now in this course, we are not focusing on the path tracing. We're going to talk about real-time properties. So this would be a see-through texture that hopefully would come handy in your setups if you're building some kind of a 3D scene, and that scene requires a 3D model to wear glasses. So for instance, if you just need a small impression of the see-through material or a see-through material that has reflections, this is your choice. This is the best thing ever. So I'm going to grab the material node and I'm going to connect it to the 3D object. And I'm going to connect it to this shape 3D. Now, the reason why we have two shape 3Ds is because we have one smaller one there in the center, just so we can see this transparent material better. Right, so with all this set, I think I'm going to go to the material setting and I'm going to do the first step. I'm going to tick on environment mapping. We do need that here as well. Now, there's a couple of more changes that we need to make, and those changes will be done in the blend modes. So I'm just going to quickly find those. Alpha transparency. First of all, we're going to change alpha mode from opaque to alpha blended. I see that something is happening, but this is not exactly what I was looking for. So in this case, not only I have to change the alpha mode, I need to change the blend mode too. So instead of linear, I'm going to choose additive. And there we are. If we increase the specularity now, we built this glass looking or fake glass see-through texture that hopefully will come handy in your setups. So the last bracket, animated materials. The starting point here will be just the same. We still need a material node and we're going to pipe it into the 3D object and primitive 3D object, the shape 3D. And now let's talk about the different inputs here. We already discovered that we can pipe in texture maps to the, say, color texture input, but we can actually use generators for that very same input too. I'm going to go for Truchette. I'm going to pipe it to the first input, the color texture. I see that it's already working. It's actually wrapping around those two 3D models via material node. That's great. I think I want a little bit more quality, so I'm going to bump up these numbers to 1024 by 1024. And I'm going to untick the roundness. I don't necessarily want this to be rounded. Cool, I think I'm quite happy with this setup. Perhaps I could give it a color too. Maybe something cyan. Cool, let's leave it at that. When we talk about animated textures, we can apply post effects and video files to any of these inputs to our better or worse outcome. For instance, I can grab the very same digital block glitch that we tried before, and apply it on a true shed. There we go. All of a sudden, this texture here is animating on a color channel with the post effect of the digital block glitch. So we can preview that in a viewport as well. Now there's a little gotcha. Let me showcase you what would happen if we would take a static image, rock solve color, apply to the first input, and then apply the very same digital block glitch on that video loader. All of a sudden I engage the playback, but it's not working. There's a good reason for that. We have a tick box. We have a tick box called static image process only once. This is ticked on by default to preserve your compute power. So if you tick it off, all of a sudden the post effects starts to work. Now, mind you, this introduces a little bit more of a load to your processing. So if you need it, make sure to tick it on. Right, I think I'm gonna come back to the true shed setting. I think I can just delete the video loader completely. And let's talk about displacements. Let's just turn off the digital block glitch for now. We do have an input for displacement map as well. And for displacement map, we could use fractal noise. So I'm going to grab fractal noise and I'm going to connect it to the displacement map. There we go. So if I preview how this fractal noise looks, now I can actually see what's going to happen. So I'm going to go back to the material. I'm going to find a slider for the displacement. And I'm going to increase the displacement amount a little bit. There we go. So now we're displacing this setup in accordance to this fractal noise. We can actually increase the threshold. We can bump up the gain. Maybe let's set gain to 1. Actually, we don't need threshold. We do need more quality. So 1024 on width and height. There we go. So with the use of creative post effects and some generators or video files, you can make some really funky and interesting looking textures that will alter your 3D models and their looks. Hello and welcome back to Material chapter of this essential course. Now let's think of this as a little bonus extra round of a talk about materials. There might be an instance in your work where you're provided with one picture and the request is to make it into a 3D setting and it has to animate in somewhat way. Well, you can actually do that. You can take any and all pictures to Notch and you can generate normal, displacement, specularity, all of those maps out of one picture that you have. With that said, let's just make it happen. Let's just build it together. I'm going to make a new layer. So insert layer, let's call this one picture. And let's build it up. Obviously, we will need some kind of a reference picture. In this case, I'm going to use this one. So I got this picture from a very nice service called Unsplash. So it's a royalty-free website that people just upload their photos in the best, highest quality, and you can just grab it and use it for your needs. Now, I do indeed find this very useful. So where do we start? Obviously, we need some kind of a Shape 3D to apply this texture to. As we connect Shape 3D to the root, I see that it came in as a sphere. That's the default state of it. I think in this case, we would make do with a plane instead. Now, if I press Alt-G, I see that it's just lying on the surface here, lying on our grid. I do want this to be up. So as soon as I change the axis to Z, I see that it's up and facing me right here. That's great. That's exactly what I wanted. Right, so I think the next step then is to grab a material node, connect it to the Shape 3D. And now the first thing we can do is grab this video loader and apply it to the first input, color texture. All right, step 1 accomplished. I think I'm going to turn off the grid for now. I do want to generate a normal map. So I'm going to add a video null because I literally want to make a copy of this texture pass. And I want to add a generated normal post effect. So let's just type it in. Generate normal map. There we go. Now, I can already see the preview here, but I could easily open it here so we see it in a viewport as well. I think this will serve us well for the normal maps. We can leave the active, well, we shouldn't really touch the active property. Depth scale, I think we can easily set it to 0.4. That's going to be great. So I'm going to untick preview in the viewport. And now I'm going to pipe it into the normal input. And notice nothing really happened. There's two things that we need to do. First of all, we should probably make sure that the deferred rendering is on, and maybe high dynamic range too. As soon as we turned on deferred rendering, Notch is asking, well, where is the light I should be referring to? So obviously we need some kind of a light. So I'm just going to grab a very simple, very regular light. I'm going to make sure that it's in front of our new shape 3D. There we go. Let's maybe push it a little bit backwards. Let's rotate it so it looks downwards. Right, and now in the material node, we have to define that we indeed used a normal map input. Since we didn't use the dropdown, Notch doesn't necessarily know that it should be referring to some kind of a normal map. So in this case, I'm going to go normal map mode instead of disabled, tangent space. And there we are. We are actually faking a normal map. Or producing a normal map, should I say. So now we have two passes. We have color, we have normals. Let's build one more. Let's build displacement. So again, we're gonna need a video null. And I presume you already recognize how video processing knowledge that we gained in the first chapter is actually coming handy here. Because the very same video processing chains and stackings are actually applicable in materials too. I think that's one of the core strengths of nodal systems. You literally can build quite a complex things out of little, small tools. So with that said, for us to make a bump map or displacement map, we need two post effects. So we need this to be in black and white first. We're gonna go for color correction. Again, the color is spelled with the U, so just be aware of that. There we go. We're setting the saturation to 0. We are focusing here. It's not piped in to the setting right here just yet. In fact, we can preview in the viewport. And we need a blur. Now, let's grab the very simple, very regular blur. It does take effect, but it's very small increment of this blur. So I think I'm going to have to increase the blurriness by adding more iterations. So maybe 50 would be a good number. I think it is. I think I'm going to stick with this. So back to the null. I'm going to tick off the preview in the viewport. And now I just have to find the displacement input. There we go. That's my displacement input. Let's find the displacement slider. There we are. Displacement slider. And we are displacing in accordance to the very same texture. Now, it's not perfect. First of all, I don't think there is a great lot of geometry going about. Indeed, it's quite small numbers. So if I come back now to the shape 3D, I can increase the subdivisions X and Y. So I'm going to bump it up to 90 by 90, just like in the previous workshop. Now it's looking a little bit more sharp. In fact, if I go to the light and enable the shadow casting, I will see things a little bit more prominent. And back to material, I think I really overdid with displacement. This right here should be all right. I'm quite happy with the displacement setting 0.2, for instance. So last bit, animation. I can grab something like turbulence, as we do have turbulence warp as post effect, and just apply it on a actual input image. I'm gonna increase the displacement amount. Oh, look at that. It's not working. Why? We already spoke of it. By default, it's set to static image process only once. I'm going to tick that off. And there we are. We are actually animating and we are displacing. And we did it all with just one texture. All right. I hope you found this bonus round interesting. With that said, we are moving on to the next chapter, and the next chapter is modifiers. We already have foundations of how things run in Notch. Let's start animating things. See you there.